Americans were in Vietnam in the 60s?
We've already been drawn in. I personally believed that the Americans were absolutely right to go into Afghanistan in order to get bin Laden.
Immediately after 9/11?
After 9/11. That was, to me, an absolutely right decision. But I'm at a loss to understand the mission creep, where we're now trying to change the whole political, cultural ethos of a country. And if you're going to choose a country to do it, probably the one you would not choose is Afghanistan.
Especially if you were British.
We perhaps learned the hard way, but we're not the only ones, and we all saw what happened to the Russians. And this is a government that is, the government is corrupt. It is a patchwork quilt of deals done with people whose political integrity is not worth talking about. And there is the most effective guerrilla experience 100 years in the making. So it is a nightmarish situation.
What do you say to the government ministers and to others in your own party and elsewhere who say that we're in Afghanistan to stop the Taliban coming back in with Al-Qaeda, and really we are there, we're in Helmand, to keep the streets of Britain safe?
Well, I don't believe that the linkage is there. You can argue it both ways, that the presence of the Western forces, basically, in these countries is an irritant, and it is aggravating the situation. I mean, but I go back to Iraq, you see. I think that was a terrible mistake. I have no time for Saddam Hussein, but in terms of the stability of the Middle East, Saddam Hussein had been an important ally of Western interest in stability. And if you overturned him, which is what we then did, there was going to be instability in a country which he had ruled with a rod of iron in often very unacceptable ways. But once you take him out, then the consequences are to be seen on the streets of Baghdad. And that's with a huge American and Western presence. Take that out, and I've always had doubts as to whether the stability could be maintained under any conceivable coalition that was likely to come into existence. So that was an irritant. And then it's multiplied by Afghanistan. But then I have never subscribed to the view that Al-Qaeda was some highly organized international conspiracy. I mean, if you take bin Laden, we don't know where he is, others may, but certainly you and I don't know where he is. But what we do know is that the sophistication of Western monitoring can pick up one bleep from a mobile telephone. So basically, I'm being asked to believe that this guy, holed up in a cave somewhere in the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier, is running a very sophisticated international terrorist regime. I don't believe it. I believe there are cells of activists, and I dare say there is some sort of loose association, but there is not a militant, well-organized, centrally directive terrorist organization. But what I do think is happening is that the present regimes that we are supporting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way we're doing it, is actually an irritant to the process.
Do I take it then that you would not look kindly on policies that would send even more NATO allied troops into Afghanistan?
This is the dilemma that President Obama faces. He's being asked for 40,000 extra troops. I think the Russians sent huge numbers of extra troops. The question is, do you actually think in the long term that will solve the problem? Now, the positive argument is that the Afghanistan army, when sufficiently trained, will be able to take over. But do you have faith in that political system, that the army will get to the stage where it can, and at what cost, and in Western lives, and at what further irritant to the world stabilization situation of which this is an important part? So I think it's a nightmarish political dilemma.
Is there a danger in Britain that we don't analyse or question these policies enough, because there is, in effect, a consensus between the three main parties. Signs of it fraying a little bit at the edges with the Lib Dems, but they're still on side, and the Labour and the Conservative front benches are saying broadly the same thing.
That is true, and I think you go back to the relationship between Tony Blair and George Bush. And I think in a sense, as an outsider, Tony Blair got drawn into this process. I think he was very anxious about it all, my guess is. And he had a conversation in which he said, look, we've got to get a United Nations resolution, which George Bush, I don't think, wanted and was advised against. But he gave in to Tony Blair. Then Tony Blair said, well, look, we've got to have a peace process in the Middle East. I don't think George Bush thought that was much of a runner either. But he gave in. But the third conversation was, look, I've got 250,000 guys in the desert. It's hot. Are you with me? And I think Tony Blair had got in too deep.
That he couldn't say no.
He couldn't say no.
And the same for Britain now in Afghanistan?
Well, that's been there a long time, but we are in. And I remember that Mrs. Thatcher used to have a saying, never get into a room until you've worked out how to get out of it.
Defence spending, which has come to the fore because of what's been happening in Afghanistan, and arguments about our troops getting the equipment they need. As we look forward, and the possibility, some would say the probability, of a Conservative government coming in May of next year, again, as a former Defence Minister, can we, the United Kingdom, can we afford to remain a nuclear power and send properly equipped troops to theatres like Afghanistan and build expensive new aircraft carriers and the fighter jets that have to go on them?
Well, there's already been, I think, a decision about the second carrier and the fighter jets. We are one of the most effective defence nations in the world. I personally would not support a policy that left France as the only nuclear power in Europe. I think that would be, I mean, just, I happen to rather admire the French, but I mean, a nuclear monopoly in Europe, that's not the history of Europe, and so I wouldn't go for it. And I think that with skill, probably we can organise the defence budget in such a context as you put to me. I mean, you've got to realise that the sort of programmes that you're asking about, the big ones, are spent over many, many years.
And they're capital spending.
They're capital spending, and they, if they're a year or two later, it is not going to bring Armageddon to existence.